right, so thanks. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, as was clear, wait a second, I'm going to hide this Zoom window because otherwise I can't see. Yeah, okay. So as was clear from the introduction, so I mostly work in the field of philosophy of mind, analytic philosophy of mind. And so most of the literature I'm going to be discussing and targeting here today is literature within the analytic tradition. And I'm going to be talking about pain as understood in this tradition mostly. So there's this widespread idea in philosophy of mind, and I think also in the medical literature, that pain is a tool for the management of bodily injury. Okay, so there's this what we can think of a model of pain that we could call injury-centered pain, which would be, this idea according to which pains are fundamentally discrete, relatively short-lived events in which actual or potential bodily damage generates nociceptive activity in the sensory periphery, which in turn cascades, causes further activity in the central nervous system, which is identified with or otherwise taken to ground the pain. My presentation insists on not moving, so I think I'll have to. It is. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So, I mean, here are just some, relatively random quotes from important papers in the philosophy of mind that talk about pain, in which, authors mention things like hitting one's elbow on the frame of the kitchen door or stepping into a bath that's too hot as examples that are supposed to trigger intuitions in the readers about the nature of this phenomenon we're studying, right? Pain. So, I mean, this definition that I gave you about injury-centered pains can be detailed into 3 different features that say paradigmatic pains, or at least, central cases of painful experiences are thought to have. So the first would be this idea that, pains are responses to bodily conditions that are threats to bodily integrity, often described as damage or disturbances. And so to the extent that the pain is a response to the threat, then it is an adaptive, an adaptive state of the organism. The second feature would be acuteness. So the idea is pains are responses to the sudden onset of the bodily condition that triggers them, but then they typically subside as the condition disappears. And then the third feature that I'm interested of, this injury-centered notion of pain is this idea that that I think I sort of, it's kind of assumed in certain ways of treating affective phenomena in the literature, which is that pains are sort of neatly separable, or at least they can be theoretically addressed as being different from other affective states, and in particular from mood. So that we can do, metaphysics of pain, or we can talk about the contents of pain, basically ignoring other affective states that subjects have. Now, some pains certainly do not sit comfortably with a characterization that's based on these 3 features that I will call adaptiveness, acuteness, and differentiation. And what I wanted to hear today is to focus on one of these pains, that's dysmenorrhea, namely menstrual pain. So menstrual pain is often operationalized in diagnosis as crampy abdominal pain that happens while or shortly before menstruating. And my focus here will be on primary dysmenorrhea, which is menstrual pain in the absence of additional clinical conditions. Actually, I think that a lot of the points that I will make, mainly about the phenomenology of the painful experience, apply to secondary dysmenorrhea, in which, additional problems are identified as the cause of the pain, but not all the points translate. So let me just focus on primary dysmenorrhea. So I will show that dysmenorrhea is different from what I've called an injury-centered pain relative to those 3 features, adaptiveness, acuteness, and differentiation. But I want to make a more sort of general point about how a certain focus on injury-centered pains has had the effect of pushing other kinds of pains, including dysmenorrhea, towards the periphery of the philosophical debate, at least in the philosophy of mind literature, where pain is it's a very, very important topic, but dysmenorrhea is hardly ever mentioned. So I'm not saying here that pains other than injury-centered ones are ignored in the literature. That's not the point. But my point is a little bit more nuanced. It's just that theoretical treatments of pain are in general guided by this idea that the function of pain is the management of tissue damage. And then pains that do not sit comfortably with this characterization appear in various senses as atypical, abnormal, or defective in ways, okay? So, and this I think is an uncomfortable situation for a theoretical debate to be in, if only because between 45 and 95% of menstruators undergo this kind of pain. So it is in this sense, at least, an extremely central kind of painful experience. And it's one which reduces the score, which reduces the quality of life of sufferers a lot. So I will just start by making a very brief point about the physiology of menstrual pain, and then I will go through these 3 different features of the injury-centered model, explaining how dysmenorrhea does not have each of these features, and then for each of them kind of suggesting one among, of course, possibly many others, research avenues that I think are opened up just by looking at how dysmenorrhea is not like injury-centered pains, and things that are, you know, fruitful once we realize that. Okay, so so as we know, menstruation is the shedding and expulsion of the endometrium once it's become apparent that the ovum has not been fertilized, right? So at this point, the tissue that the epithelial tissue coating the uterus basically sheds, right? The tissue that was prepared to host a fertilized egg sheds, and that's what we expulse when we menstruate. So during menstruations, uterine contractions, which are actually present throughout the cycle, increase, some say, to labor-like proportions, and these contractions help clearing menstrual blood and endometrial remains. Dysmenorrhea happens, according to some, when these contractions are unnecessarily severe. So the idea here is, you know, compared to non-dysmenorrheic menstruators, though dysmenorrheic menstruators have contractions that are more intense, more frequent, arrhythmical instead of rhythmical, and they have in general a higher uterine basal tone. Okay, so let me address now the first of the 3 features that I mentioned that are characteristic of injury-centered pains, which was what I called adaptiveness. So here the idea was that in general, pains, injury-centered pains, are responses to bodily conditions that are threats to bodily integrity, and which can be described as damage or as disturbances. And so it's to this extent that pains are adaptive. Now, there's this sort of mainstream way of talking about pain in the philosophy of mind, according to which we could call, you know, the intentionalist mainstream, according to which this notion of adaptiveness is best cashed out in terms of pain's semantic aptness. So here the idea is pains are, you know, responses to certain bodily conditions that trigger them. And then what pains are doing in like the mental you know, economy, as it were, is sort of targeting this bodily condition, and, you know, to put it somehow, you know, telling the organism that something's going wrong. Pains target this bodily condition, and they typically, the idea goes, get it right. Now, what it means for pains to getting their triggering bodily condition right depends on the kinds of view that one holds about the, you know, the contents of pains. Some people want to talk about pains as representations of bodily conditions as bad. So this is the evaluativist account. The idea here is, you know, your pains represent that a bodily condition is bad for you, and that's why they hurt, right? Other people prefer to talk about pains in imperative terms. So they want to talk about pains in a line more similar to how we would talk about just imperative sentences, as it were. So what pains are doing for us is, you know, giving us orders or commands to actually act with respect to the triggering condition, and in particular to get rid of it. Okay, so that's the general approach to pain on this intentionalist framework, never mind the details, I think there's sort of a general problem that these sort of accounts face when it comes to menstrual pain, which is that the disposal of endometrial tissue brought about by uterine contractions during menstruation, which is in principle what triggers the pain, is a perfectly adaptive process. It's an integral part of the correct functioning of the female reproductive system. So to that extent, it is not true that uterine contractions and endometrial disposal is a damage or a disturbance for an organism, right? So, I mean, that's kind of a very, I'd say, simple criticism problem for this way of talking about pain. So in a simple analysis from this intentionalist analysis, if you're an evaluativist, you're going to say that menstrual pain is an illusory pain, right? Because you've got a pain there, it's telling you that something's going wrong with your body, but that's not true. Or if you're an imperativist, on this simple analysis, you're going to say that there's pain here. It's telling you that this uterine contraction should stop. But of course, you should not follow this imperative because that is something that's good for your organism, that the endometrial tissue is expelled through the uterine contractions. So, I mean, this is a sort of a general problem for this sort of approach because, I mean, for any theory about a given phenomenon like pain here, it is a significant threat for the theory to just deem a very clear and very common instance of the phenomenon, namely dysmenorrhea, sort of a problem, corner case, like an illusory pain or a misguided pain. I think that's not, I mean, that's kind of an unwanted consequence of this way of talking about pain. And just to not finish this section with like a negative note here, I think there is, I mean, one of the things I started the talk with that is an interesting idea still within this framework, intentionalist framework, to focus in and to focus on and to elaborate, which is this idea of uterine contractions being unnecessarily severe in dysmenorrhea. So this idea is a little bit ambiguous. I'm not going to elaborate on the ambiguity here. Here's just one way in which this idea of unnecessary severity could be elaborated. Maybe the thought here is, uterine contractions that would be uterine contractions less frequent, less intense, more rhythmical would already be enough to dispose of endometrial remains. And that is exactly what menstrual pain is targeting, is indicating, okay? I mean, that is a way of putting things that brings menstrual pain a little bit closer to the injury-centered model, or at least a little bit closer to something that intentionalism about pain could theorize about. Because, I mean, the idea here would be, well, when you've got menstrual pain, if you're an evaluativist, you would want to say, well, your pain here is representing it too severe for the job thing, right? Like it's telling you that you could do things a little bit milder. Or from an imperativist perspective, maybe it's an imperative to stop having such severe contractions because less severe would be enough. I mean, maybe that's one way of putting things from the point of view of intentionalism. But of course, I mean, it represents a significant departure and significant elaboration from the views as they are set, at least at the moment, because in principle, resource inefficiency, like this idea that, you're investing too much in a process that you could do with less effort. This idea of resource inefficiency is not the sort of disturbance or the sort of damage in principle that intentionalists have in mind when they talk about pain in these terms. So yeah, that was my first point. Now, when it comes to acuteness, this idea that the injury-centered pains are paradigmatically acute, right? They are a response to the onset of a bodily condition, but then they subside. This notion of acuteness is different from the notion of chronic pain, which is typically operationalized simply as pain that persists or recurs for more than 3 months. And I want to suggest here that dysmenorrhea does not clearly instantiate acuteness. And in fact, while this acute chronic axis is often taken to exhaust temporal behaviors of pain, dysmenorrhea cannot be neatly categorized as either. As we just heard in the previous talk, dysmenorrhea has a sui generis temporal profile because it follows, I mean, what we heard in the previous talk was menstruation being cyclical, and dysmenorrhea follows menstruation, right? So it occurs repeatedly for people suffering from it. And each episode extends for a limited period of time. So I think that because of this, dysmenorrhea actually shares features of both chronic and acute pains, and that it makes it a possibly unique case when it comes to its relation to pain catastrophizing. I think that this temporal profile makes it a possibly unique case when it comes to the phenomenon of pain catastrophizing. So on the one hand, we've got the fact that dysmenorrhea recurs. So it is bound to occur at the beginning of every menstrual cycle. And because it is recurrent, it can result in central sensitization. That, in that sense, dysmenorrhea is similar to chronic pains, right? So central sensitization is this phenomenon by which repeated nociceptive activity triggers long-lasting increase in the excitability of spinal coherence, which results in pain hypersensitivity, which is a process that's at the background of pain chronification. And there are studies that show a correlation between dysmenorrhea and hypersensitivity to pain. So while this is important to characterize the temporality of dysmenorrhea, it is also important to know that episodes of dysmenorrhea in themselves are relatively short-lived, right? The pain recedes after a few hours. So in this sense, it's similar to acute pains, right? So it has similarities with both pains. Now, I think it's very interesting to think of how this temporal profile interacts with various beliefs that people have about, people including dysmenorrheic menstruators have, about their own pain in the case of dysmenorrhea, right? So on the one hand, because of this temporal profile, people who have dysmenorrhea can become, to some extent, experts on their own pain. So, I mean, they basically know when the pain will start, when it will end. They can know to the extent that they can know their menstrual cycle. And maybe relatedly, dysmenorrhea is often assumed to be part of normal bodily function. Not ascribed to this idea, but at all, but it is a fact about, how things socially are, that very often we think of menstrual pain as, a normal thing, a thing that people need to put up with. Given these two sets of beliefs that people hold about pain, I think that it's plausible to think that, this interacts in an interesting way with how much people feel threatened by pain when they are menstruating. And that's the notion that's what psychologists talk about as pain catastrophizing, which is this tendency to overestimate the threat that a pain stimulus represents and to feel helpless when in pain. And it is measured with a standardized questionnaire called the pain catastrophizing scale. Now, the reason why this is interesting is that there are studies that show correlations between pain catastrophizing and pain chronification. And in particular, there's one study that establishes a correlation between pain catastrophizing and dysmenorrhea, right? So the more people tend to catastrophize about their pain, the more they tend to suffer from menstrual pain. Now, for time reasons, I'm going to be really quick here. So my point here about this one study in particular is that the scores of pain catastrophizing used in this study are a mean for all the items in the pain catastrophizing scale. And I think that the pain catastrophizing scale, because it is a standardized scale, includes items that just do not speak to dysmenorrhea's peculiarity. In particular, they do not speak to the beliefs that I've said women hold about their pain, partly on the grounds of the pain's cyclicity. So the questionnaire includes items like, I worry all the time whether the pain will end. I wonder whether something serious may happen. And I think it's worth at least exploring the hypothesis that there might be, a sui generis kind here as well of dysmenorrheic catastrophizer, because it seems, at least on the face of it, a little bit weird to hold the belief that, your pain will never end, or you wonder whether something serious may happen, and simultaneously holding beliefs about, how your pain actually ends, because you know about it, because you're an expert on that, and about, how your pain is a normal experience, whether this belief is accurate or not, which I said probably isn't. I'll be very quick with this last section here. The last feature that I wanted to examine about injury-centered pains is this idea that we can approach them theoretically, like apart from any other affective experiences that subjects may have. And I think dysmenorrheic pain is a kind of pain that questions this assumption and this way of working, because even if it's clinically identified with painful abdominal cramps, dysmenorrhea thus involve a cluster of mood-related phenomena. We've got some testimonies in the literature that talk about how their attitude changes when they menstruate, how they get irritated, how they get angry easily. And we also have negative effect as part of questionnaires that are used to actually diagnose dysmenorrheic pain. So, I mean, crying, loneliness, anxiety as part of, say, the discomfort that goes with dysmenorrhea. And I think that when these two mood and pain-related symptoms are involved in menstrual discomfort, they're typically, I mean, that's kind of a speculative claim here, but that's an idea. They're generally not experienced as completely unrelated or sort of merely juxtaposed, right? They're experienced, sometimes at least, as somehow related to one another. Here's a testimony that talks about how the tearfulness alerts her that she's going to start menstruating and like having this painful period are experienced to be related to the bleeding just as much and in much a similar way as the pain is experienced to be. Now, I think that it wouldn't be surprising that the mechanisms underlying pain and mood in dysmenorrhea overlapped. As a matter of fact, it's a hormonal process known to affect moods. There is evidence that the neurophysiologies of pain and depression are in fact intimately related, not just in dysmenorrhea. And I think people have put forward this notion of a pain depression diet to talk about certain conditions like fibromyalgia, in which you've got mood and pain symptomatology that make up like a complex affective experience of the subject, in which these two things have a common cause. And I think they would be, I kind of suggest here to maybe generalize this notion to a pain mood diet and think of dysmenorrhea as this kind of, as a condition along these lines. Just to conclude, I've argued here that dysmenorrhea does not conform to the injury-centered model because it does not feature, or at least it calls for a refinement of adaptiveness, acuteness, and differentiation. I think that the discussion of each of these properties respectively in dysmenorrhea respectively opens up research avenues that are worth exploring, and that this can help, sort of promote a model of pain that is capable of finally sort of encompassing this very widespread experience, and by doing that, probably sort of underpinning this idea that it is a pathological experience worth of full attention. And I'll leave it here.